slow, or if you want to hear all my jokes again.
That's so clever.
Or if you're like, anyway. So today is the 24th, end of week 2. We're in the lab section. We have a lot of people still coming in. Like I said, there's a coat rack up there if your table gets there. If you got your laptops with them, break them out. You can follow along. By the way, we're going to go through a couple of tutorials. I'm going to go through them just at a pace because I want to make sure everybody's kind of at the same level. But if you've done this before, you've been in a class with me before, another professor, or you just want to go ahead, by all means, go ahead. Right? I'm not going to hold you back. Right? At this point in your IT career, there's no reason to hold people back. So I'll show you where those are. So it's all in Blackboard. So let's go out to class notes. Just to let everyone, show everyone, we put a version 3 of the sprint schedule. We basically stole a week from sprint 3 and pushed it into sprint 1. So we just shifted everything down to give you a little more time because we're still getting, there's a few teams that haven't signed up for anything yet. So I don't want them to show up and say, oh, we weren't ready, we can't turn anything in. I'm like, well, here's a big zero. We don't want to do that, right? So we're going to give you a little more time to get off the ground because it's initial planning. So you'll see the updated dates and deliverables here. If you go under week 1, again, under project documents, I made a slight adjustment here to the sprint rubric. Basically, I clarified a couple points, and you'll see those highlighted in yellow, right? So there's just 2 lines I added. They're highlighted in yellow. Basically, to the operations job, there's 2 more points. And then under assignments, and I emailed this to everyone, but just to make sure, the case studies I posted, in the previous semesters we had less people, so we were able to have you give like an oral 5-minute presentation. With 60 people and 30 in a lab, we can't do that. So you'll see I just kind of crossed out that unique requirement posted in a discussion board. You don't need to do that. So you can just pick 2 case studies. If you all want to pick Netflix and Uber, that's fine. I recommend picking something you use. There's, like I said, there's 200 plus case studies there. Dig through, find something, that's interesting, right? And the rest of the assignment's the same, but I just removed that. That was just cut and paste from the previous semesters. Okay, sound good? All right. Back under course notes, class notes. Here are those are week 2. Okay. You're going to see 2 tutorials right there, so 2 PDFs. The source code, I'm going to provide some sample code. By all means, you can, just like any open source project, you can use it. Fork it, right? Use it. Or if you've got your own code or you want to go your own way, you're not required to use this by any means. But I want to give you at least something so you can get started, right? And at least we have kind of common denominators. So if you're saying, hey, I was looking at the sample, I changed this, couldn't get it to work. Now it's not just me working with you individually. You've got the 30 people in here and 30 in the other class, and if you have them in other classes, you can kind of work together. Plus you have your Slack channel where you can kind of work with your team, or send me like direct messages through Slack, and I can jump in and help your team there. You'll see below it another link as well. This is an open source textbooks I wrote. So I've had opportunities to teach ITMO 456 and 556 in the past, so I just cobbled my notes together into like a 14-chapter book. I take the train for years. I have an hour each way. You write a book. But anyway, I took these tutorials and basically crafted them into a chapter. So they're chapter 13 and 14. There's a link right there to the releases. If you're really gung-ho, it's all done in Markdown. Yes, I wrote a 300-page book in Markdown. Just try and like doing tables, and there's other things, all these edge cases you find out. But if you're really gung-ho, you can go right to the GitHub repo, you can download it, you can then get the build dependencies, use Pandoc and build your own, or you can click the release tab and just download the PDF. It's hooked up to a build server, so anytime there's changes, once a day it builds. So if you want to follow along. But anyway, it's free, it's open. Some students ask me, does it cost anything? No, it doesn't cost anything. Yes, you can keep it for all eternity. If you want it in a concise chapter format, it's there as well. But basically that book is the same as the PDF tutorials up there, just kind of more streamlined. Okay? So if you have these open, or you can follow along, let's go over these as well. And then we're going to give you a little assignment just to kind of basically run through these tutorials. Where did that go? Because we want you to be able to build infrastructure, right? Build infrastructure. So if you want to follow along too, I'm going to use some of the sample code. If you go under week 2 class notes, for those who just came in, you see the middle item. You can simply issue a git clone command, and you can clone the entire sample repository, right? If you want to follow along from there, or for reference. I would suggest cloning it versus just downloading it, because maybe I'll make changes, or maybe a bunch of people will ask and I'll make another sample, and that's why you can just do a get pull, and you can pull the changes instead of having to download everything and then copy over, right? It just makes it a little easier in that sense. All right. So I'm pulling up my, let's open the documents first. So 2 documents, one says Packer IO and one says Vagrant. And as we talked about, they're kind of, so to speak, Vagrant open twice. Okay, they're kind of like cousins, so to speak, brother and sister. And they're meant to work together. So let's go over Vagrant first. We did this a little bit the last day. We talked about what it is, right? We talked about it being from HashiCorp, and what was the problem it solved, right? And there's a few more links in here if you really want to get into the DevOps term. Remember we talked about DevOps being 2008, 2009, kind of coined the ability of taking elastic computing, or what that time was called utility computing, cloud computing, and seeing it for what it was, the ability to automate not just code, but infrastructure, config files, documentation, right? So that you could automate most of the work and move on to actual challenges, right? Service, making actual money, right? If you're interested, there's a link to more HashiCorp's take on DevOps defined. You'll hear companies slapping that term into products, like this is a DevOps product, right? One of the worst things is, somebody asked me one time, said, hey, in the department, which classes are DevOps classes and which ones aren't? Because I don't want to take any non-DevOps classes. And it's like saying, that's not a real, there isn't a divide, right? Now, people may think there's a divide, right? But there isn't a divide like this is a DevOps class, right? Because you want to be careful to not label DevOps as just a technology. It's like, oh, they're using Git, so those must be DevOps people. These people aren't using Git, so they're not, right? It's not that cut and dry, because DevOps it's like democracy, right? There are various forms of democracy within the general concept of democracy, right? My wife's from South Korea, right? They're a democracy, right? A fully functional electoral democracy, but they have, socialized medicine. Well, if you look at the country, it's about 35 million people. They're a homogenous people, right? They're just Koreans. There's not a lot of, like America, where we see around here we got people, all God's people from all over the place, right? So they have a united history as one people. So to them, it's just obvious. It's not socialism. They're not socialists, right? They're just like, hey, you take care of your neighbors, right? Because the mountains or cities are all close together, right? So you wouldn't label that, right? But they're same like America, but different, right? So it's not about the technology, right? So you don't want to say like, we're a DevOps class because we use Vagrant, right? Now you'll find Vagrant being used in quote-unquote DevOps places, right? But it's not because of it, right? It's the methodology of we're streamlining, we're automating, right? We want to get to solve problems, not be bogged down in artisanal. Now there is a place for artisanal creation, like artists who craft things by hand. We're not saying everything should be manufactured or research. Sometimes you're just playing around, right? You want to explore and experiment. So we're using Vagrant here. And like I said, Vagrant can work with VirtualBox, Hyper-V, Docker, and VMware Player. Unfortunately, you need to buy like an $80 plugin, I said, but they give you 10% off if you're a student. Right? To make it work. That's just VMware's thing. It's not a Vagrant thing. If you have Vagrant installed, the best thing to do is, right, type Vagrant version, and does something come up, right? Does something come up? You know what? That's the wrong thing. Yeah, Vagrant version, right? So I've got version 2.2.3. If you've got one a little older, that's fine as long as it's the 2-branch. If you're using Linux, don't use apt-get because it will bring down Vagrant 1, and none of the example stuff will work with Vagrant 1. So make sure you're either using the package manager for Mac or Windows, because then it puts it in your system path. If you're in Linux, just go right to vagrantup.com, download the dev package, and install the dev package, and you're ready to go. Okay. So if you don't have Vagrant installed, feel free while I'm talking, go back over that list of software, go get it, right? You don't have to listen to me, like, step by step, like I said. For those who came in late, if you want to follow along, that's great. If you want to go ahead, go right ahead. Don't let me hold you back. The idea is I want to get everyone, by the time we're done, on a common plane, right? Your team on a common plane, right? So if you have Vagrant, try and get to this point, right? Vagrant version. That way you know your path works, right? It's installed, you've got a recent version. That's like the first thing you should check, okay? Vagrant does, by the way, if you go to vagrantup.com, I'm going to ask you to go through this part. I'm not going to go through it now, but if you go to Getting Started, again, they have a tutorial where they go into these concepts. So I'm going to talk about these concepts, but not actually walk you through, do it for you. But I'll talk about them, and hopefully you do them, and then the concepts come together, right? So the only thing in this tutorial you want to skip is the share section. The sharing section asks you to sign up for like Vagrant Cloud. It's a way to store Vagrant boxes on their cloud so you can share them with teammates and stuff. It means you need to make an account. It's secondary to the actual Vagrant technology, so you can skip that section. If you want to use it, you can, but for the tutorial to get to know it, you just go straight down. Okay? So let's go back to our tutorial. Also, for those who came in a couple minutes, we're under week 2 class notes. You'll see 2 PDFs there. We're basically walking through those PDFs. If you've already got this done or done this, that's okay. You can go a little forward. The second link for those who came in is sample code. It's sample, Vagrant, and Packer configurations. You can clone that and use that. You don't have to use it, but just to get you started, you can clone my code there. The third one is just if you want to learn more in a textbook style about these 2 tutorials. I basically put them into a chapter in a book. You can download that. That's totally separate from there. Okay. All right. Goes up here too. Earlier too, we covered this the first day about why Vagrant. So for the different groups, developers, operations, designers, which pretty much covers all the roles, right? So there's no reason for you to say, oh, my job, I can't use this, right? That's just not applicable here, right? Installation. We talked about this, so we're going to skip this installation part here. And so my tutorial is a couple years old, but you get the point. You get a version out, right? Make sure if you're using Windows, make sure you're using the PowerShell derivative, whether you're using the PowerShell 5. I recommend the PowerShell Core, PowerShell 6, just because it has more flexibility and it has better readability. The old PowerShell, the light blue icon one, is really, the dark background is terrible with like purple and red highlighted fonts. And so when we get into Linux and virtual machines, your VI or your Nano console is going to syntax highlight, and it doesn't understand the layers of abstraction, and you can't read anything. Trust me, I've been there in class demonstrating it, and students are like, well, that's completely useless, right? So I'm warning you, PowerShell Core, PowerShell 6, does it better natively. Yes, you can go change the color scheme to get like a matrix, black on green kind of thing if you want, but then you lose the color coding. It makes it like the ancient terminals. So I'm trying to, make life as easy as possible. Okay. If you do get a command not found after you install the process, go back and double check. Check everything worked okay, that it wasn't to the wrong disk, or the command failed or something. So Vagrant works with what are called, we're going to work with Vagrant and VirtualBox by default here. But Vagrant to abstract away different virtual machines, right? Because every virtual machine platform has a different container technology. When I say container, it means there's some kind of virtual hard drive and some kind of configuration file, right? So for instance, VirtualBox, right? What's the disk format for VirtualBox? Anyone, if they took 454, you might know, or 301?
VDI.
Yeah, VDI, right? So what's Microsoft's and Hyper-V's virtual disk format? Which is, it's an open standard too, by the way. It's VDH, virtual disk hard, or VHD. VDH or VHD, right? And then what's VMware's, right? VMware has one across all their platforms. Anybody? Ian should know. VMware, what's their disk format? VMDK? Yeah, VMDK, right? And then that works for VM Player. Docker's a little different because they just have whole container images. And so each of those has then an additional configuration file which says, all right, here's the network card, and here's the, the boot order, and here's the, floppy disk emulation driver, right? And then that gets packaged up into what's called a box. That's Vagrant's terminology, right? So it's .box. So Vagrant generates .box files, which simply contain whatever underlying abstraction, in this case VirtualBox, you're going to make. Okay? All right. So there are two ways to obtain box files. You can make them, or you can get them from the store, right? So on vagrant.up, there are also third-party sites you can get them from, but this kind of trumped all of those. You really get them here. You'll notice this find boxes, right? So if you're really quick, you're like, hey, I want to find Ubuntu Xenial. You can go right there. Someone's made it, either the Ubuntu Corporation or just a third party, some guy or girl, and you can just simply pull these down, right? They work pretty well right out of the box. They're usually base installs unless it specifically says, hey, this is PHP, Laravel framework, or something like that. So the two ways to retrieve them are using the, right? These boxes need to be added to your system, right? So Vagrant keeps a little internal list or database, so to speak, of what boxes you have, right? So that way you can run that box. So every box has a name. That name is, just a comment, it's internal to you, but it's probably a good idea to name the box the same thing as what it is. So instead of calling it box 1, you should say, this is FreeBSD 11. This is Xenial, Ubuntu Xenial 64, not box 1, box 2, box 3. Because then you're like, oh, where's my FreeBSD? Oh, Chrome, I gotta download it again, right? And then you have to go download it again, okay? So these commands here allow you to operate on boxes. So you have the Vagrant command, and then one of these commands, right? Vagrant box add, Vagrant box list, Vagrant box outdated. We won't use that at all. Vagrant box remove, repackage and update. People ask like, hey, I want to move these boxes to a different computer. Technically, it's like the wrong way to think about it. Like you should actually just rebuild it and pull your source code down, but I guess they caved into enough, feature requests, and they said, all right, you want it? We'll put it in here, but this isn't the recommended way. So what we're really looking at is add, list, and potentially remove, okay? So on your system, my system, I've got a bunch of command already, installed from previous lectures. So I'm going to do a Vagrant box list, and you'll see a whole list. If you've just installed Vagrant, well, yours is going to be blank, right? If you go through the tutorial, you'll get a couple items in here. Okay. So let's do this. You can see some samples down here, right? These are some exercises that are not in the tutorial, but this is a whole smattering of, there's a CentOS 7, there's a Debian Jessie 64, there's some guy named Terry Wang who created an Arch Linux, right? There's Concourse, which is an actual software. It's kind of like a Blackboard kind of for managing videos and stuff. And Concourse Company put theirs out. What OS is it using? I don't know. Either CentOS or Ubuntu, but they were like, hey, just Concourse is pre-installed, try our software. You know, there's whatever, FreeBSD, now they're up to FreeBSD 12, Alpine Linux, right, Xenial Bionic, and more and more. So if you want to, you know, try some, just try it. Just, you know, add a bunch of these, right? The fastest one would probably be this one, because CentOS 7, it's just the server edition, it's pretty small, so it will fly down pretty fast. The university upgraded the wireless last year, so you can pull all these down and don't have to worry about it. We've got really good throughput, and you're right under an access point here too, right? So you should get pretty good throughput, right? Downloading them. So go ahead and try and download one, right? If you want to, I'll just hit this here. One thing you want to make sure though is wherever you end up working with Vagrant, you should have some kind of nomenclature in your mind to clearly differentiate where the resources for this box is, that box, that box, that box. Because otherwise you'll get confused and the file names are all the same and you end up confusing yourself, right? So just out of habit, you'll notice I'm in this Packer Vagrant build Packer, right? I cloned that sample code I gave you. This is the hierarchy for the sample code. Now, this is my hierarchy. It makes sense to me. You can do whatever you want with it, right? You don't have to follow me, right? I'm not expecting you to copy me, right? So your data, what makes sense to you, right? And so if I do an ls, you notice I have all these directories here, right? And if you see these directories in my Vagrant box list, you'll notice, hey, wait a minute, they kind of match. Now, I've deleted a bunch of things, or I've reformatted them in my system a bunch of times, so I don't have all of these at once, because virtual machines do take up hard drive space. You don't want to like cram up your system with, you know, like 1,000, you know, virtual machines. But it makes sense to make a directory, right? So you'll notice I have a CentOS 7, CentOS, right? So that way I know all the resources related to it are there. So I'm going to come in here, and I do an ls, and well, it's empty, right? This is my sample code, it's empty because I didn't want to put anything there and confuse you. So I can do this two ways. I can do a Vagrant box add CentOS/7. Now, there's a syntax shortcut here. By putting in the CentOS/7, that was the name given to us by Vagrant, right? And essentially, it's a shortcut to, right? It's a shortcut to this right here. Right? Technically, this has a URL of, right, HTTP, right, vagrantcloud.com/boxes/CentOS/7. But the Vagrant software has a nice little shortcut in there that you can say, hey, just go to Vagrant Cloud. This is the syntax, right? So this kind of company/version is a syntax to go right to Vagrant Cloud. So I can do this, right? And it'll start to say, hey, I don't see this here, I'm going to go out and fetch it. It also gives you this choice of, hey, what kind of provider, meaning what virtual machine software you're going to use. We're going to use VirtualBox here, so I'll hit 3. And it says, oh, okay, I'm going to go get it from vagrantcloud.com/boxes versions, da-da-da-da-da. Now, the reason that happens is because you can download third-party boxes by just putting a URL directly there. So you can say http:/boxes, whatever. And you could also put a relative path, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So when you build boxes with Packer, you can do ./CentOS box for class.box. And it will import that, right? Okay. All right, it's going pretty fast, which is good. As they say, never do a live demo. The fates, right, are usually against you. Great. So it's done, right? The box has been added. So if I do an ls, you're still like, wait a minute. Nothing there. Correct. Vagrant has, under your user account, so in Windows, it's like C users, Joe Smith, Jane Smith, and Mac, it's something like slash. Yeah, they don't let you, don't want you poking around there, but it's in your user account. There's a hidden directory of vagrant.d. Also, there's a VirtualBox directory, because if you're using VirtualBox, that has a place for it storing the virtual machines, right? So it will physically be there, which is nice because it means you don't have to worry about it, right? Because you're letting Vagrant abstract this, you're not worried about like, oh, is it in the D drive? Is it on, C users backslash? For all intents and purposes, you don't even have to see it, okay? The second thing we need to know about then is how do we interact with this virtual machine, right? If you were using, and see here's a syntax example where the Dev1 guys and girls, right, you could download this directly from their site. Or here, which I'm going to show you in a minute, you can add via local, right, just a /. Note that these ways up here require a -- name. You have to name the box. If you're getting something directly from the Vagrant group, it will automatically name the box after what it's named, so you don't have to add a -- name. Although I guess you could override it, but at that point you just kind of take theirs, for instance, right? And so you see a Vagrant list, right? If you wanted to remove the box, right, you could do Vagrant box remove, and it would remove it from the list, right? So you can do that. So normally, if this was like a virtual machine has its own packaging format, or virtual box, called an OVF. An OVF file is essentially a container. It's a box file, right? That's how you can export them and send them and share them around. So we need to type a command called vagrant init, right? So vagrant init will create what's called a vagrant file. This is essentially it's Ruby based, but it's essentially what Vagrant parses to change the configuration commands of VirtualBox. So do we want a public network? Do we want a private network? Do we want 1 gig of RAM? Do we want 2 gigs of RAM, right? All those questions, do we want it shared folders, mapped folders, right? All those options you would have if you launch VirtualBox, go to settings, you can see there's tons of settings. Those can all be configured from this Vagrant file. The nice thing is it can be configured multi-platform, so you can have, depending what you're using under it, that goes away. So if you run the vagrant init command by itself, it will generate a blank template, right? You'll see all this code in there, but it's all commented out. So what you need to do is go into the directory, right? So I made a CentOS 7 directory, so this is where my init file for CentOS 7 should be, right? Because it makes sense. The problem you're going to run into is the configuration file is always called V vagrant file, right? Vagrant makes it. The problem is if you have multiple boxes, each box has its own vagrant file. And if you try and use just one, you'll end up destroying and clobbering the same one every time. So this is why a hierarchy makes complete sense, right? So you will do a vagrant init CentOS 7, because that's the name of the box, right? And when I do this, you'll get a little message saying it's done. I do an ls, and you see a vagrant file, okay? So I'm going to open this in Vim. You can open it in Notepad or Visual Studio Code or Atom, right? And when I open this up, you'll see basically the syntax here. Now, this sample gives you like commentary, so it tells you what all this stuff does, but it's all commented out, except for the first option, config.vm.box, because you got to tell Vagrant, hey, I'm going to start something. What am I going to start? And it goes to start CentOS/7, because then it goes and says, CentOS 7 is located at this place. Let me send this command to VirtualBox, right? So really it's like a translator, right? But it's simplifying it. You'll notice here that there are options for, instead of using the VirtualBox NAT, you can turn on public. If you're using VirtualBox, that's called a bridge network. So this room here, we do have our own wireless. That's not the school's wireless, so you don't have to authenticate, which means we have tons of IP addresses. We can build our applications. Each person can take 5, 6, 7, 8 IPs, right, per their own project. We can't do it on the school's wireless because you have to authenticate all these things, and we're going to destroy and create stuff, and it just wouldn't work. The nice part about here, if we get this dynamically set up, you should be able to work in the class and go home and just modify a configuration file of IPs, and your project should still work. Right? And we've done that. And it can be from 192 to 10 back and forth because you're just reading from a configuration file. So this gives you a lot more flexibility. Unfortunately, it can't work like in the school library because you can't get public IPs. Right, and there are other options down here. So for instance, you can set IP addresses, hard code them. I would recommend against that in this case because we're going to be dynamically assigning them. There is a section for memory down here. You can uncode this, uncomment this, and modify the memory requirements. You do have to uncode the start of this block though, where it says config VM provider, and then this end value here. So it's a little Ruby block. If you've done any Ruby, you'll recognize this. If you haven't, you don't have to learn Ruby because the syntax is right here. Of course, Vagrant's got documentation as well, so you can go look up this in more detail, but I think the paragraphs that are there are pretty straightforward. Okay. All right. So now that I have a Vagrant file, what can I do with it? Glad you asked, right? And you'll see the examples of items here. Okay. The first command, now this assumes you have VirtualBox installed, so if you haven't got to that point as well, you got to go back and get VirtualBox as well. Otherwise this will fail, it'll say, hey, no provider found. So once you have a Vagrant file, every Vagrant file can be Vagrant up. This is equivalent to going into VirtualBox and hitting the little play button, right? So it's actually literally sending that command over to VirtualBox, right? It's abstracting it, right? So Vagrant up will start it. You can also do Vagrant up provision. This is important because if you change the Vagrant file after the first boot, the system does not reread it. You have to force it to say, hey, I made a change. Reprocess that, right? There is a provider command because sometimes virtual boxes, if you're using Hyper-V for instance, you can say, by the way, it's a little bit different networking, Hyper-V, right? Since we're using VirtualBox and all these machines are made for VirtualBox, you don't have to add a provider entry, but if you're, VMware or Docker, you could force it this way as well. There is a Vagrant reload command, which is simply a reboot, restart it, right? And then you can also do a reload provision if you need to modify things on the fly. Vagrant provides a suspend command, which is simply put it into hibernate. This is pretty good if you have a virtual machine you're working on for a class. You don't want to start up, start down, especially if you have services started, things are running. You can just do a Vagrant suspend and it will pause the machine. And that way, coming back to it, you'll get it right back up real quickly. The only thing you want to watch out for is sometimes computers get confused because you're dealing with a virtual machine which has its own networking stack, which is then being virtualized through the hypervisor down to your OS, and that machine goes to sleep, and your main machine goes to sleep, and sometimes the virtual machines get confused with the clock and or the networking, because they're like, oh, you were at school, now you're at home. Something about it, I've seen this happen, where it just stops working, right? Or it's horribly it's a week out of date, and nothing that you do can force it to catch up. So just be careful closing your laptop without doing a Vagrant suspend, because most of the time it's okay, but that one time you'll spend 10 hours banging your head against the wall looking at old posts, right, and nothing fixes it. What fixes it is just always suspend or halt it. Vagrant halt is a shutdown, right? Do that instead of just closing your top, right? I've learned from experience. One useful command, especially for experimenting, is the Vagrant destroy command. Now, the destroy command is different from the remove. The destroy will reset your virtual machine to where you unpacked it. So let's say you download CentOS 7, right? And we install, Apache Web Server and a bunch of other stuff, and then we go, oh, you know what? I want to try Nginx, and I have to uninstall all this stuff, and it's got a conflict. So you could go download another CentOS 7, make another folder, or from the command line, if you issue Vagrant destroy, it will basically all the deltas, all the changes that have been made since the initial run are just simply discarded, and you get a fresh system in a matter of seconds, minutes, right? So this is really good, especially too, to keep a bunches of CentOS laying around, so you can just be like, oh, let me try to install this. Oh, okay, didn't work, blow it away, right? Instead of having to re-download stuff. Okay, and I'll show you that here. So for instance, let me run this. If I type Vagrant up, the first time you type Vagrant up, it will take a little longer to install, because what it's doing is it's also pulling down some additional dependencies and installing the VirtualBox guest editions, right? And so you're going to see it download a bunch of stuff, restart, and do it again. That only happens on the first time. You might get a little dialog that says, which network do you want to connect to? Because if it detects you have a wire and a wireless plugged in, it will prompt you for a connection up there. So that way you can change if need be. And you may get an error at the end of this, or not an error, a warning message about not being able to mount synced folders, and I'll show you how to get rid of that. Just another command we have to run. So I'm going to let this run in the background here. Okay. Once that's done, the Vagrant up has completed. The way you connect to the box is Vagrant SSH. So somebody asked me, well, what's the IP address of the box? What's the username and password? The answer is, I know what they are, but it doesn't matter. So the whole concept of Vagrant is, it's abstracted that way, right? It's set up the port forwarding between the NAT so that you can SSH into the system. There were some options there for allowing port forwarding. So if you have a web server, you can, through Vagrant, go to localhost 8080, and it will pass port 80 from the web server over, and you can actually work as you would want to work on your application. So Vagrant SSH is nice. It does all the authentication through private key RSA. And you'll notice, well, here it's installing all the dependencies, the first time dependencies. Right, but if you notice when going back up here, a lot of dependencies. Right, you see right here, SSH. So technically you could SSH to 127.0.0.1:222. Every successive VirtualBox you launch, it will increment that to 223, 224, 225, so you don't have to worry about manually signing that. And you saw RSA private key, so by default there's an insecure shared common RSA key. And so technically you could SSH into your neighbors, if they had a public IP address. But now they changed it so that on runtime there's a dynamically generated key pair, and that's inserted, and the old one's tossed out. So you just simply Vagrant SSH, you're in. Although the way we're going to get to is hopefully we get to a completely automated fashion where you won't have to SSH in, because you'll have everything scripted how you want it to be, right? We're going to try and get there to an immutable state. All right, and so you see right there, it got its dependencies, it's recompiling the kernel with the guest additions. Like I said, this only happens once. If you do a Vagrant destroy, of course, it'll have to do it again, but this is a small price to pay for the convenience. Especially something like CentOS 7, server edition, it's pretty light, reboots really quick, right? You can get a lot of mileage out of this, right? A lot of mileage out of this. Any questions, comments? Any experience? I know some people had this from other classes, but any other people had any experiences or any other points they want to add? I know some people have already emailed in some points. Yeah?
So do we make our Vagrant file inside the box that we download?
So it's up to you, but it makes sense to put it in a folder. If it's going to be CentOS 7, you make some CentOS 7 folder, and you then do a Vagrant init box name in that directory. And that way you always know, this Vagrant file is tied to this box because it matches the folder name, right? It makes sense. And then if you have another Ubuntu, you make another folder for Xenial64. Then Vagrant init Ubuntu/Xenial64. And then you'll have a whole series of Vagrant files, but since you have a hierarchy, you know right away, this one's related to this. That's my recommendation, but something like that makes sense.
So put the file in the folder.
Yeah. The next section in the tutorial dates back to a couple years ago, so we had a lot of Windows 7. Windows 7 does not have a native SSH client. Windows 8 doesn't either, so if you have Windows 7 or 8, you can still get the free upgrade to Windows 10, which I would highly, highly recommend, because it's free and it's for the life of the device. But if for some reason you got to stay where you are, this section will show you how to modify your system path to use the git SSH executable, which is in a hidden place, into your path, so that from the command line you can use SSH. If you've got Windows 10, SSH is native, right? Just go to PowerShell. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to click anything. It just happens natively now. And you can find that by doing SSH, so there's dash capital V, right? If you're on Mac, of course, you've got a bash terminal. SSH client is native. If you're on Linux, of course, it's native. You don't have to worry about this. So if you're on Windows, make sure you can get this output. For some reason, if it doesn't show up, there is if you go to settings, right, and then if you go to settings, add, remove programs, there's manage optional features. Bunnies. Under optional features where you can add languages, you will see a OpenSSH client. There's also an SSH server that's now native to Windows 10 and Windows Server. We don't need the server at all, but the client should be installed by default, but if not, you can browse, maybe if you did an upgrade or for some reason it didn't take it, you can click add feature and it's in the list, you just click it and it comes on. Okay? If you're having issues, check with your neighbor, double check you're in the right place, right? Okay. So you notice right here that everything finished successfully, right? And I got back to my command line prompt. So now to connect, I would do vagrant SSH, right? I don't have a password, don't have a username, and okay, you'll notice the prompt has now changed. It just says vagrant at localhost, right? New name -A. I am now connected to my CentOS box, right? Which is kind of nice. So let me try this. Sudo yum install httpd, right? That's the web server, Apache web server in Red Hat Linux world, right? So I'm going to install this pretty quickly. Okay. So remember, each vagrant file controls a box. So most likely you're just in the wrong place. So it's a path hierarchy. You're in the wrong folder. Yeah, but you got the concept right. I'm going to make sure this is started. CTL start HTTPD. Okay. Status. All right, and I'm going to just enable this really quickly so it starts at boot. Okay. Now let me exit back. So I'm not exited out. You end a session by exiting, right? I'm going to open this vagrant file again, and I'm going to come up here to this where it says public network, right? Now public network, the terminology is kind of weird. In fact, even in their own documentation, they say we need to change this. But this essentially makes a bridged network connection, right? Which means it puts your virtual machine onto, for instance, if you're on this network in the classroom here, you'll get an IP address, right? That's routable within this network, right? Not external or public, like a public IP address, right? So that you can communicate with other virtual machines. Now the trick to do that is not to get on the school's Eduroam or IIT Secure, but you'll notice another one down here, right? SmartLab TS2030. So let's click that, and when you hit connect, it's going to ask you for a password, right? But you're not going to have to authenticate. I'll put this in Blackboard, but the password is, it's a Netgear, so they do that funny thing where they pick two random words and a name, a number. So the password is joyousflower337, right? All lowercase, one word. Joyousflower337. And I'll post that in Blackboard here. But once it connects, all right, I lost my connection there because I jumped networks. Let me come back here. You then can make a network in this room. Where am I? 8131. So what I'm going to do here is uncomment that, and I'm going to go up here, and this port forwarding, just to kind of show you the advantage of it, I'm going to uncomment this port forwarding. It basically says, hey, you have a guest, which is the virtual machine, and a host. That's your underlying operating system. And it will forward communications across. So guest, port 80, the web server. My host, 8080. Okay, that's fine. And then they have this host IP syntax. We'll leave that. You know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to leave this commented. I'm just going to uncomment this first. Okay. All right. And I'm going to issue a vagrant reload -- provision to make it reread and set up those port forwardings here. And you'll notice it should go pretty quick. Those are famous last words, right? Let me open up a browser. Okay, so I left the IP address natted, so it's 127.00.1. You know, of course, you can't go through a NAT 10.0.2.15 VirtualBox NAT, right? Let's see here. So how am I? Notice it restarted already. See how it says booting VM? Pretty quick, right? And notice up here you see that the SSH is port forwarded, and also now that this was added as well, 8080, right? So it's waiting to log in. Brute forcing connecting to it. It should come up in a second. So what this will allow me to do is go here, right? And I will be able to, all right, guest editions are fine, RC folder. All right, I've got the prompt. Now without even logging in, what do I have there? Well, this is the hello world, right? For Apache web server. Notice I've just port forwarded through, right? If I'm on an airplane or a place where I don't get public IPs, Vagrant now gives me this ability to actually render my application. I want to check my application. Granted, this is the hello page, but if you've got your whole application there, think what you can do now. How long was that? How long did it take to do a Vagrant up, or Vagrant, box add, Vagrant up, 15 minutes, right? Imagine if you had to, get this set up, racked and switched, and and then you just tear it down 5 minutes later, right? That would, drive the infrastructure people crazy. They couldn't support it. It's just not even conceivable, right? Now we push it back to you and your high-powered laptop. Let's go one step further here. Vim vagrant file. I'm going to comment this back out. Okay, and I'm going to come down here to the public network and uncomment this. So now I don't need to worry about the port forwarding. I do need to worry about what the IP address is going to be, but we can find that out here in a second. And I'm going to issue a vagrant reload provision. Okay, I'm going to see it restart. It might tell me the IP and the little booting thing. I might have to log in and just do an IP ASH. So take a second. Now, if you're not re-provisioning, this will go even faster because it will just simply restart. All right, so when I do this, it says, hey, by the way, you're going to bridge to the network. Which connection do you want to connect to? Since I'm only on the wireless, I'm going to hit 1 for wireless here. But if you have a network connection, you can do it over the network. And it tells me, hey, you now have 2 adapters. It keeps the NAT, because that's how Vagrant communicates, and then you have a bridged adapter. So it'd be just like going into VirtualBox, going network settings, adapter new, making a second adapter, right? Or it'd be like back in like 301, you were doing hardware work, right? There'd be like the professor saying like, here's 3 more Ethernet cards. Connect them, right? So functionally what you're doing, but it's virtual, right? Those were some fun times. I remember a long time ago I used to teach that class. Okay. Alright, done and done. So if I do a vagrant SSH, and now this is, if you're on the Smart Lab wireless network, this IP I find out here, you can all access it from your web browser, right? Remember it's Joyous Flower 337. You don't have to, but let me find the IP address. Okay, this one is here, 10.0.0.67. So I should get the same here, right? All right, so it works. I don't need to put any ports after it because what's the default port for HTTP traffic? Everybody? You all know this one, right? Port 80, right? So if you don't actually, if you're on the Smart Lab network, now if you're on the school wireless, you can't get in through the NAT into our network here. So of course it'll say, 404 timed out, right? But if you're on this local network, you can get in and access this. So this is how you'll build your application. You'll build 4, 5, 6 pieces of it, assigning IPs, hard coding it, and you'll have it all living on your laptop, right? At least in these the first 3 phases. And we'll see how far we get in 4, 5, and 6. Okay. All right. I think that's it for Vagrant. The last thing you want to add at the very end, and I described more about these in detail, so if you really want to see more in detail, just blank. Is this blank just for me, or is what? Is it blank for everybody? Oh, that's weird. Oh, it's not good at all. Let me see if somehow. Well, the last thing, and I'll see pretty much whatever's there is there's nothing critical that. I'll get that document fixed, but the critical part is done. So now that I've exited, right, and say I want to shut it down, I can do a vagrant halt, which will power down. Vagrant suspend, which will suspend it, and say, for instance, I want to, I'm like, I don't want the web server anymore. I can do a vagrant destroy. Destroy is not delete, it just rolls back, remember, to the pristine state. In this case, I'm just going to do a vagrant halt. Right? Halt it. To avoid you'll notice up here that Vagrant has a default shared folder. So if you're just, experimenting or you have a data set you want to get in and stuff, there's a default shared folder. In the Vagrant file, there's actually a way to map a custom folder. So if you're like, hey, I got a data folder, I want to map it, you can do that. There's only one other thing you have to add to make that work. Otherwise, you'll get a warning message on the very line saying, I can't do this, driver's not loaded. It's not an error, it's just a warning. It looks pretty scary, especially in PowerShell. They put it in like flashing red like letters. But they're like, it's just a warning. Okay, and the way to get around this is Vagrant plugin install Vagrant-VB guest. So Vagrant has a series of plugins for other third-party tools, and you can look at their Vagrant plugins list. A lot of the plugins were simply features in the beginning that weren't in the software, but as the software has grown, they've absorbed that feature. So a lot of them are unneeded. This one's still needed because it relates to VB VirtualBox. So you go ahead and run this. This was at the end of my tutorial, which I don't know what happened to the end of the last pages. So I'll get that put back up. But you just run this once, and you can run it from anywhere because the Vagrant command's in your system path. So you just hit it, and it'll say looking for this, not getting the dependencies, and it'll say done. It takes about 30 seconds, minute tops, right? And that will allow you to share folders. Now, do you need that? No, but it gets rid of that warning message and just makes Vagrant happy, right? So, okay, one line of code. See, done. I had it installed. If you have it installed too and you run it again, if there's ever an upgrade, which I don't think there's been an upgrade in a couple of years, it just kind of does it. Go ahead, right? Won't hurt me. Okay, so any questions on Vagrants? And we kind of whipped through that. That's okay. I'm going to ask you to go back through Vagrant's Getting Started tutorial, right? Or you can kind of experiment on your own, right? We just kind of want to get the muscle memory to get used to this, so that we're talking about some software, or you have your project. I've seen a lot of your outlines, which look really exciting, and you're like, hey, this is not working, or we can't figure this out, or what happens to our database schema when we have encryption at rest? I'll be like, you know what, let me go home and build it, right? So I can pull your source code down, build your application, and you and I, or you and your team, or you and other teams can sit there and say, all right, we're all looking at the same thing. We all have this same component, right? Other than us kind of all leaning over your shoulder and kind of scrunching around the screen, and say, well, it worked last night, it worked on my machine, right? We want to avoid that, right? Kind of get to this unified model here, okay? So Vagrant is great, especially for quick one-offs, quick testings, quick, you're like, oh, I forgot the Ubuntu command to remove old kernel editions, right? You just simply spin it up, right? And you run it, and then you shut it down or destroy it, right? Great for those kind of things, especially because then you're like, oh, I don't gotta go download an ISO and then install it, and 30 minutes later, let me come back, and oh, I forgot to hit enter, and the install didn't finish, right? Really good for quick testing and quick prototyping, right? But when you get to the brass tacks of, you generally don't, want to use other people's stuff for your production system. Why? I'm sure they're nice people, but you're responsible for this, so you probably need to know what you're putting into the system, right? And some companies are very regimented about, it can only be this version of code, or this version of Java, or this Python version, right? And we have a security CVE scan for all the libraries to make sure we don't have a vulnerability for a library we're putting in our code, right? That happens a lot, like especially with JavaScript and Python, with so many libraries. I asked the developer from Here Technologies, and I said, how do you, use Python and JavaScript? They're like, all the time we use them. And they're like, how do you check, or Maven and Java? I'm like, how do you check all the dependencies for your libraries to make sure you're not putting like a vulnerability into your, $1 million applications? And he looked at me and he just laughed. He's like, there's one lady whose job it is to handle that. So he's basically saying, yeah, they put someone in charge of it, but it's so massive a job that a team of 10 people couldn't, do this. So that was coming from Here Technologies, right? So that's kind of right, scary in a little bit. So from the sample code, right, Vagrant, my build scripts here, we're going to now move over to the second tutorial, the Packer tutorial. Okay. So Packer is the tool you're going to use to build all of your machine images, right? So initially we're going to start with VirtualBox. I know some teams are already talking about moving to, using AWS and some VMware as well. That's great. You can build those instances all from the same source and just change the output. So we're going to start with VirtualBox and then we'll migrate up, because we want to make sure that everyone can still build it without having someone kind of pulling the team ahead and like, I'll handle all the cloud stuff, right? You want to make sure everybody's involved here, okay? And you'll notice Packer's on the little list, little decal, looks like a little totem pole, right? We talked about why use Packer. Once again, pre-baked images have lots of advantages, of course, right? Right? It's all here. There's more, the link to this. Packer works on any OS, all kinds of Linux, Mac OS, OpenBSD, FreeBSD. I think there might even be like Solaris, even though it doesn't exist anymore. If you use a package manager, once again, you don't have to worry about paths. So this next section you can skip, because the package manager, if you're on Linux, once again, go get the executable. This is not a D package, it's a zip file, so you have to unzip it and stick it in like user local bin, or you can put it in a thing and add to your path manually. So the Linux people have one more step of work. Yeah. it's a self-contained executable. So you may be thinking in your mind, wait a minute, you were talking about Ruby, Professor, I don't have Ruby installed. The HashiCorp people started building everything in Ruby, switched over to Go, and what they do is they build self-contained executables. So it's a package that has the version of Go and all the libraries in there. In fact, if you've studied any Go, the Go language from Google, that's what it does. Whenever you generate an executable in Go, it adds all the dependencies to the actual file. So you get everything at once. You don't have to worry about like the Python problem of, is it Python 2, is it Python 7, is it this? So that's one of the nice things about Go, if you've done any Go work. Packer conventions, these are the things we have to start up with. So the main convention is Packer uses JSON, which is really, at first, kind of messy to read, and it doesn't initially have provisioning for comments. Now, you know, so let me pull up the sample code here. I'm going to pull it up, and then the subdirectory Packer. So I'm going to go under this Packer directory and then this vanilla install. So if you've cloned it and have it down, and I'm going to open up this Ubuntu 18.04 vanilla.json. I'm an Ubuntu person myself, have a long history with Red Hat. I think I told you the story about disappearing gateways. That kind of sealed me, scarred me forever. So we're going to break this file down here. So we're over Ubuntu 18.41 vanilla. It's just a plain install, right? It's not adding anything special. This is a good template, right? Good template, because you can modify from this to customize as you need. This is the database. This is Redis server. This is the web. This is the caching server, right? You can customize from here. But you'll notice all these key value pairs, right? And the syntax. Now the system parses it, but it's a way to basically give answers to the questions that an install would ask you, right? In a sense, it's like an answer file, right? So you're going to have two types of questions. One, you're building this, so you're going to have the question of, well, what platform is it? Well, it's VirtualBox. Okay, VirtualBox is going to have a bunch of questions like, what type of OS? And what format are you making? And, right? And then the operating system is going to have questions once the install starts to say, okay, what's the time zone? What's the keyboard? How big is my hard drive, right? And then Packer itself is going to have questions for you saying, all right, I need to know what the username and password for the root account is so that I can SSH in, meaning I, Packer, and do some final housekeeping, right? Some additional things you want me to do, right? So this file kind of handles all three, satisfies all three of those people, so to speak. Okay. So let's take a look here. Packer also makes use of something called Preseed for Ubuntu and Debian-based systems, and a Kickstart for CentOS and Red Hat-based systems. These are, unfortunately, completely incompatible answer files. So it's a way to basically say this time zone, this keyboard, this much hard drive, right? They have two different syntax structures that do the same thing. There's been work to kind of merge it together, but yeah. Anyway, I have some sample ones already included. You need to have a Preseed or a Kickstart, or otherwise your install will go back to manual, right? It'll go back to asking you, what's the username, what's the password, should I format the hard drive, right? So I've got some sample ones already done, and you will see them under a Preseed folder, right? And then there's a KS for Kickstart. So you can take a look at them. They're minimal out of the box, and you'll notice here that I've got some different ones. We had some different examples in different classes where we attached multiple drives, so we had to modify a little bit of the Preseed and the formatting. You can modify these as you see fit, right? But the base sample, for instance, here you'll see these are literally all the questions you get answered to, right? And this is their syntax. The KS, Kickstart 1% CentOS is the exact same, but just almost identical. You'd think they'd get together and solve it, but because it's IBM's problem now, right? All right. So this is what the JSON template looks like. The first main category is a builder category. You're going to tell Packer, what are we building, right? What are we building? All right, then simply name, type, guest OS. Basically saying, hey, when you go to VirtualBox and say new, right? These are all the questions you get from VirtualBox, and you select this. This is kind of a nice, very nice feature. You give it the media URL. So you don't have to go download anything. Now you could go download it ahead of time and point to run a local web server and point to it. But the nice thing about Packer is it will cache every successive download. And you can change the cache location to like a generic location so that you don't get, Ubuntu in 5 different directories when you're downloading the same, whatever, 1804, right? And Packer has this fierce desire to not give you broken artifacts. So for instance, it requires a checksum from the download media. This example is a little bit obviously old, 16043, but if you come back here, right, you'll see right at the bottom, line 39, right, here's a more up-to-date one, and then there's the SHA-256, right? And you put it in there, right? So this will retrieve that ISO image, and it will store it in a directory called Packer Cache, wherever you just ran this Packer script. There is, and I'll show you here, a way to make a system variable, either in your bash RC file or the Windows environment, where you can say, hey, make Packer Cache dir, dir, put it here, and then it will always go over there. That saves you from piling up 600 megabyte images all over your system, right? Especially if you've already downloaded it, it will skip the download and just reuse the ISO, which is very good if you're building 5 systems. You've now saved like a half hour, right? Because you have it local. Okay. You'll notice some other values here. This HTTP directory, these are default values, but essentially Packer runs its own internal web server and hosts your pre-seed or kickstart file so that it can pass that information in the boot command to say, by the way, continue your automated install by going here. I know it's pretty ugly, but remember, operating systems are meant to be manually installed. So these are the hacks. Really the only way, the only software out there that can kind of do this, right? Outside larger systems like Jumpstart or the Windows SUS, those services. They ask you for the SSH username and password because it needs to be able to connect in, right? So by default, I left mine all vagrant, right? Probably not secure, but right? If you want to modify that. This SSH wait timeout, you may need to modify this value, especially if you've got an older computer, because what happens is there's a little counter from the beginning to the time the install finishes, and then the system SSHs in. And if it doesn't get in by 30 minutes, it will kill the job. Well, we had a poor young lady who had not poor as in economics, but unfortunate lady, whereas she had an old MacBook, and it took 31 minutes for her to do the install. Well, guess what? At 30 minutes, it kept dying. It's just wasted half hour. We bumped that up to 60 minutes, problem solved, right? So if you want to bump it to 60, that's fine. I don't think if you've got anything recently, a recent computer, you shouldn't have any problems. But if the network gets slow, that pushes the install. You might, if you have it dying consistently, kind of towards the end of your install, that might be it. Communicator. This is just a section of back when Windows was trying to undermine SSH back during the days of the evil empire. You had Microsoft creating WMI. Right, which is really good technology, right? It was their kind of automation and SSH style for server configuration. Since we're using Linux, this just stays SSH. This command is important here because it basically helps your user, right? This echo vagrant is because of this username vagrant, right? It basically allows you to shut the system down without having to type in a password, right? This helps kind of give sudo permission, right, in that sense, without having to modify any other files. VM name, of course, that's what's going to show up in VMware. Hard drive interface and disk size. Remember, it's a thin provision disk, so it does not provision 20 gigabytes. It provisions just a little bit more than you need, and then it grows as you need. So 10, 20, 8, right? If you have problems with disk space, perhaps see if you can get like a bigger drive, clear some stuff off. get a USB drive, move some stuff over like that. So don't let your computer hold you hostage, right? Space-wise, do what you need to do to be able to do that. This command, even though the indentation's wrong, this boot, it's all still in a line. This boot command, as you saw, and I'll go back and run this here. So let me go back up. I'm going to go into vanilla, right? And I'm going to do packer build Ubuntu 18.04.1, right? So I'm going to actually start to run this off. I showed you this the other day. All right, so here you'll notice I already downloaded it, right? And so it's skipping the download and it's just using the cached instance, so it starts right away, which is nice. This boot wait is this time here, right? Right, you wait 5 seconds. Now this boot command everything that's under here, boot command, is what you see going on the screen. Now, someone once made a joke that this is actually one of my lectures, right? BS, 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 BS. A couple pieces of information and more BS. No, right? But that means backspace, right? Backspace, right? And so what it's literally doing is entering those keystrokes, right? You can modify this, but this template will get this to happen. And somebody had to experiment and count all that, and then they share it wide. You think this would be in the documentation, but it's not. You have to hunt this down on the internet. Anyway, I hunted it down, and of course, from Ubuntu 16 to Ubuntu 18, it changes, CentOS changes, but I've got all those preset up, so please just use that for that boot command to save yourself some trouble. You'll notice various options over here. Notice this pre-seed URL. Anytime you see anything encapsulated by double curly braces, that's a Packer variable, right, that they self-defined. This HTTP comes from the value, that 9001 value set above. And this just happens to be located in pre-seed CFG. That's my preference to put it in a folder called pre-seed. You could make a universal pre-seed folder, but you basically say point to it so that it can start serving the answers to the actual install. You see this coming here. There are other things you can set here, like for instance hostname. Hostname's called please change me. This is probably where you want to change it. So you know that this is production server, database server, test, whatever you want to call it. People sometimes they give their, they name their servers after Muppets or elements of the periodic table. Whatever works for you, right? So you can set that here, and that's what will appear in the little, when you log in, the name tag, right? Not so that important because we're probably not going to be logging in much, but just to help you when you have 5 windows open, you're like, which one is this again? It makes sense to label it, right? The rest of this is about keyboard and time zone. By default, I set all my samples to UTC, right? Everyone's familiar with UTC for time zone, right? So what is UTC? Well, let's back up. What time zone are we in? Yeah, right? Are we daylight saving time or not daylight saving time? Are we in DST or not? Yeah, that's where we mess with the clocks, right? Except for Arizona, they don't mess with the clocks. Right? So this is important because lots of places, some places in Europe are actually thinking of getting rid of it. The clocks change, right? UTC doesn't change. They just arbitrarily picked, England as 0, and every time zone increases 1. And a lot of computer systems, they recommend using UTC because 1, it doesn't change. So imagine if you're on a shift, right, and all of a sudden there's an extra hour, less hour. What happens to payroll? That messes things up. But also if you're troubleshooting with maybe a remote team that's in a different time zone, right, you now have to translate, oh, this happened at 3 p.m. Well, that's really 6 p.m., but it's 5 daylight saving time, and then you got some weird, the 30-minute ones, right? And then the North Koreans just screwed everyone, made a time zone that was like 15 minutes off. They relinquished it, but for a while they did that. And then Mexico City did something where they were like, the entire country of Mexico had time zones, right? And then Mexico City was like, we're just not going to observe it. And that screwed up all the flights, because now the flights had to like mid-air adjust, well, we're landing at this, and then they changed that back and stuff, right? So time zones cause a lot of trouble. UTC just gives you a artificial time. So you may look at the time and it's...
Professor, what about China? They're on the same time zone.
Yeah, and China, she's right. China, the government mandated that the whole country has one time zone, even though they're maybe 4 or 5 time zones long, right? So that really messes things up. So UTC just has an arbitrary thing that doesn't change, and that way you can have kind of unanimity, like everyone has the same UTC, right? So, because you're not worrying about where are we, it's just UTC 600, 0600, it's UTC 1200, right? And everyone knows what it is. So, if you look at the clocks and they're messed up, it's because I set the examples to UTC. Okay. This section below here, this is just something I added to make the install go faster. You can add custom VirtualBox commands. You can say, hey, for the install, use 2 gigs of RAM. You can attach additional hard drives here, right? Anything else you can do in VirtualBox where you can select options, add, you can do here as well. This third, it's not required though. This section down here, provisioners, is where you tell Packer, oh, by the way, once the install is done and successful, restart that virtual machine, connect via SSH, and run this shell script for me, right? Now I put a path to that shell script. It's relative because I have, a build directory and a scripts directory. So that's why I have a .. So that's once again my nomenclature. You can change it to whatever makes sense to you. But for the vanilla stuff, I have just a basic post-install vagrant. I would recommend you work at least with this as a template because there are some customizations that Vagrant needs in order to run the way I showed you, right? And I included them, so to make your life easier, you should probably just work from there. So if I go to scripts and then post-install Vagrant, you'll notice here that, and I put the links to where I suffered through in finding all this, so you don't have to. The first thing basically puts your user, if you name them Vagrant, into the admin group and modifies the etc pseudowords file so you don't have to punch a password in, right? So it makes it seamless. The second one is what injects the private key and gets the correct permission so you can just do Vagrant SSH over RSA. The last one was just something I put in there. It's a brute force. Doesn't need to be there, it's just there. So I recommend starting with at least this and then add your customizations, apt-get, whatever you want to install below it, right? Because you need, for Vagrant to work, you need those first 2 blocks, okay? So please take those, it'll save you hours of trouble. And then this last section is important. This is where you convert the VirtualBox artifact into a Vagrant box. So you see post processors, right? And then it says what type? Vagrant, right? And then there's another question, keep input artifact. So it will delete the OVF, the VirtualBox, and leave you just with a Vagrant box file. But if you want both, change it to true. The only problem you have to be careful is if the artifact already exists, the Packer script will fail, right? So you can't have a file won't overwrite itself. So a lot of people get in trouble like building it and it fails, and they're like, why is it failing? It's like, oh, because I have the artifact I don't even want from the previous thing. So false is a good default. And finally, the output. It's basically Packer saying, where should I put this? Now once again, this is just a path. It's relative to where you ran the Packer build, right? I created a directory called build, and then put all the boxes in there. Once again, totally arbitrary. It's just my nomenclature. If you want to put it somewhere else, go right ahead. Also, the name of the file, you notice there's this build name, provider, timestamp. These are all Packer variables that were defined above, right? Build name, right? We said it was a 1.2 server, right? Provider, VirtualBox. Timestamp gives you an epoch timestamp, which is the number of seconds. So it will always be its time converted to a integer, right? It's just a count of the number of seconds. So therefore, it will always be unique. Because once again, Packer will never overwrite a file. It will fail, not destroy an existing file. So this guarantees you'll have a unique file every time. And then since it's an integer, you know the latest one is just the highest number, right? Because that's how you measure time with it. So So this is merrily going along. Once this finishes, you'll see the provisioner and you'll see the post processor come up in my PowerShell screen, right? Because the system will have SSH'd in, and then that will close it down. And then I'll show you what we have at the end. Well, let me show you this before it'll take too long. It will look like this. Okay, we'll let that just go on its own. Right, it's like a cooking show, right? I show you, I have the cake pre-made off to the side. Okay, so here I have this build directory. This is where I put all the artifacts. I do an ls, and you'll notice at the bottom I've got a bunch of .box files. Well, good, right? So let's now tie Vagrant and Packer together. How do we get Vagrant to work with these? Okay, I don't actually have to move this anywhere because Vagrant will do the copying for me. And once this command is done, I can actually delete these files because machines pile up and you don't run out of space. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a directory called vanilla class, right? Or in class, right? Because this is my example right now, right? So I'll call it that. You'll probably want to say, database, web server, right? Make it something so you know what it is. Okay? So I made a directory. I'm going to go into vanilla class. I don't have to, but just I'll do it. And then I'm going to do vagrant box add, and I do a dot slash. Let me do this. I'm going to go back out of this directory. And a vagrant box add dot slash. Remember, dot slash means what? Right where I am, right? Pathwise, right? And I'm going to add the last one I made. Let's say Ubuntu vanilla down there, right? Okay, so I have this one. And then I'm going to do a -- name. And this is where you give it the name that Vagrant's going to reference it by, right? You saw me do CentOS 7. So this is where you could say, web server. All right, if that's what it is. Or you could say Ubuntu, I'm going to say Ubuntu in class or vanilla in class. Give it a name so you know what it is, right? So I'll say vanilla in class because that's just what I'm going to do. All right. And so now that I'm doing this is just like when I did vagrant box add CentOS 7. Now I'm just, instead of doing an HTTP location, I'm just doing a local location, right? And it takes a minute to basically unpack that. Done. If I do a vagrant box list, you will see the one I just added. Okay. Let's see, where is it? Here, in class. Okay. And how do I access it? Well, I made that directory, right? Vanilla in class. So I'm going to go vanilla in class. Do an ls, right? Okay, there's nothing in there. So what command should I do to create the file to control a vagrant box?
Vagrant init.
Yeah, vagrant init what? The name of the box, right? Right? So because I'm old and I can't remember things, I name the folder exactly what the box is. That's a little mnemonic trick. It works really well because then you're not like, oh, is it vanilla box 1? Is it vanilla server? Right? You just kind of paste it everywhere. And so vanilla -in class. And I see this here. And remember, vim vagrant file. I don't have to modify anything out the box. It's got class right there. Hey, great. And how do I start the vagrant box? Vagrant up. And it'll start to unpack it. Okay. So we're coming up on time here. I don't know if does anyone have to skedaddle for Math 180? I've got to go to Stewart Building in like 10 minutes. It's impossible. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pretty much end here. We'll rest the time for your team. There's still one team here that hasn't given me any in the discussion board. You're missing your team, who's on your team and your project, and the Slack channel. So there's one of I've got 14. I can put it all up on the board, but whoever it is, I don't want to embarrass you. So we're going for a few minutes. Yeah, you can come in. Give me 1 minute. So please get that to me so I can get the stuff to you, and you can start making use of the Slack channel between your group, because you're going to start giving out what's the role, who's doing this, what do we need to do, right? Here's the diagram. I sent out invitations to the Trello project management board this morning to the first 4 teams at 15. I got to get your information posted so I can get that to you. I'm going to give you a small assignment here. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. I'm going to ask you to go through the Vagrant Getting Started tutorial, right? Kind of like we did, skipping the share. And then I'm going to ask you to do what I just did, clone my sample code, build the Ubuntu vanilla, add it, right? Vagrant box add your artifact, okay? Vagrant up, get it running, and then essentially we're just going to have another markdown sample where you just give me basically 2 screenshots. Vagrant box list at the end of the Vagrant tutorial, and Vagrant box list at the end of the Packer tutorial. Right? And you don't have to show me all the steps, because if you get to the artifacts, I know that you did them all, right? Very simple. So I will post this officially. We got another week. You can make use of your Slack channel, work with each other. Of course, you can work with other people in all the different classes. If you have a question on here, you hit me through the Slack channel. We'll try and keep it all there. If we find out there's like something common to everybody, we'll either post it or we'll make a small video or something like that. Question?
You'll post the lecture recording, right?
Yes, this is recorded. Yes, I'll download it and probably post this later tonight. But everything I went over is off these PDFs in here. I do have to fix that last part of the Vagrant tutorial. Everything's working in chapter 13 of this link, though. My source examples are here. And so, with that, any last comments, questions? Yes.
If you run Vagrant but don't specify, does it give you an error?
No, it will generate a blank template. So it'll put the word box where it says config.vm.box. And box doesn't exist, but it's just text. And so it will say, cannot find box, right? So you want to resist, unless you just want a template to play with or copy, right? You want it to generate the template out. Always have a box in mind to init, and then that saves a lot of trouble. But you know what? If it happens once and you forget it, hey, that's the point here. So just one more thing to keep in mind. Maybe you've done this before because you've been with me, you've been through these tutorials. Hey, great. Maybe you haven't done this, right? That's okay too, right? Because it's not a race, or there's not an expectation of like, oh, you don't know this, you haven't done this. You know, we're here to learn, we're here to grow. So maybe you'll need to lean on a classmate, maybe they'll lean on you. Maybe later when we're doing the project manager design, they'll lean on you, right? And it's okay. So we want to push you. We believe that you've had enough experience in technology. You've been here for 4 years, or collectively 4 years, that I don't think anything here is beyond your grasp. You know, I went through a lot of stuff fast, but once you sit down and look at it and try it and work with it, we don't think anything here is beyond your capability to do, right? Or to learn with just a little bit of effort. Okay? All right, so I'm going to leave you to it the rest of the time. The lab is open actually till 1:50, so if people want to stay and work a little more, please work with your group at least now. Make sure you have your project determined, because that determines what you're going to build, who gets what role. Start assigning those out. Use the Trello board. Start putting tasks up. Start, communicating, and start getting that ball rolling. Right? Okay. All right. So we're going to end the recording here. And good luck.
Not in person.